My name is Erin Vance, and I am 30 years old. I served 14 grueling months as a Navy logistics officer. When I finally came home to San Diego, my house was gone. My parents had sold it, forged my signature, and given every cent to my brother. I stood before my red door, but the key failed. A stranger appeared, claiming she bought the house from Gary and Teresa Miller 6 months ago. My mother just smiled and said I was not using it anyway. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from right now. I backed away from the porch, my combat boots heavy on the stairs my parents had sold for a profit. I didn't scream, I didn't pound on the door, and I did not beg for the stranger to understand my pain. I simply walked back to my Ford F-150, climbed into the cab, and locked the doors. The metallic click of the lock was the only sound in the humid San Diego air, a sound that signaled my transition from home to mission. Most people would expect a breakdown at this point. They would imagine tears, a frantic call to 911, or a desperate confrontation with the neighbors. But 30 years of living and 14 months on a carrier in the Middle East teaches you that panic is a luxury you cannot afford when the perimeter is breached. My silence wasn't a sign of shock, it was the quiet preparation of a hunter. As I sat there, I felt the familiar weight of the invisible chain of a survivor. This is a psychological trap for people like me, the ones who are always expected to be strong so that the weak members of the family can stay comfortable. For decades, Gary and Teresa Miller have treated my resilience as a resource to be harvested. I was the daughter who survived the storms so that Trevor could keep his feet dry. This invisible chain had kept me compliant for years, making me believe that my duty was to absorb their failures without a word. But that chain was finally snapping. I wasn't a daughter mourning a home anymore. I was an officer conducting tactical data reconnaissance. This wasn't a family drama. It was a balance sheet that had been criminally altered. I opened my ruggedized laptop and connected to a secure hotspot. My fingers moved across the keys with the clinical precision I use to track thousands of tons of military hardware. I didn't ask why they did it, and I didn't wonder how they could be so cruel. I focused entirely on the available data. I navigated to the San Diego County Property Records portal. The document loaded instantly. A general warranty deed, filed 6 months ago. Sale price, $650,000. I followed the digital trail of the wire transfer instructions buried at the bottom of the closing disclosure. The proceeds, every single cent of my hard-earned equity, had been funneled into a corporate account. The beneficiary wasn't my parents. It was an entity called Summit Maritime Solutions. I shifted to the California Secretary of State Business Registry. The official filing appeared on the screen. Registered agent and sole manager, Trevor Vance. My 33-year-old brother, a man who had never held a job for more than 8 months and who had already bankrupted 2 previous attempts at entrepreneurship, was now the CEO of a maritime logistics firm. He had used my $650,000 as his personal seed capital, while I was literally managing real maritime solutions for the United States Navy. The profound audacity of his grip made my jaw clench, but my eyes remained clear. Trevor had even used a variation of my career to name his fake startup. It was a masterclass in narcissism. He hadn't just stolen my property, he had attempted to wear my life as a costume. I stared at the steering wheel, my mind drifting back to the summer I bought that house. It wasn't just a property, it was a certificate of my survival. While my peers were spending their graduation money on trips to Europe, I was working double shifts at a maritime terminal in San Diego and picking up weekend logistics consulting. I saved every penny of my Navy pay, living in base housing that smelled like industrial cleaner, just so I could afford that specific view of the coast. I remember the day I painted that front door, a shade I called Victory Red. I spent 8 hours sanding the wood, the grain biting into my skin until my hands were raw. Every stroke of the brush was a promise to myself. This is yours. No one can take this. But in the world of Gary and Teresa Miller, ownership was a fluid concept, always flowing in the direction of Trevor. For decades, they convinced themselves that because I was strong, I didn't have needs, my success was just a surplus to be harvested for Trevor's latest genius idea. In their minds, selling my house was not a crime. It was just rebalancing the family portfolio. They viewed me as an infinite well of resources because I never complained. I was the reliable one, which in their language translated to the one they could rob without consequences. The phone vibrated on the dashboard, a frantic dance against the plastic. I let it ring until the silence in the cabin felt heavy enough to shatter. Then I pressed accept. Erin, darling! We lost the connection earlier. My mother, Teresa Miller, chirped. Her voice was musical and airy, as if she were inviting me to a Sunday brunch. Instead of explaining why she liquidated my entire net worth, you really shouldn't have just hung up. It's quite rude, especially after all we've been through planning this. I'm sitting in the driveway of a house that doesn't belong to me, Mom, I said, my voice clinical and flat. You sold my property. You forged my name. A light, breezy sigh puffed through the receiver. Oh, honey, don't be so dramatic. We were going to tell you over a nice dinner this weekend. You just came home early and ruined the surprise. We had a whole celebration planned for Trevor's big launch. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Ruined the surprise? You sold a $650,000 asset without my consent. Trevor really needed the seed capital for Summit Maritime Solutions, she continued, her tone shifting to that patient condescension she had perfected over 3 decades. He finally has a real business plan, Erin. $250,000 in equity from that house is going to change his life. You weren't even using the place. It was just sitting there gathering dust while you were out at sea. Besides, the Navy gives you a housing allowance anyway. It made perfect sense. I heard the rustle of the phone being snatched away. My father, Gary Miller, took the line. His voice was a deep, authoritative rumble, full of that unearned power he used to keep the family in line. Now, Erin, stop making a fuss, he commanded. We are a family, and families share resources. You are a strong girl, and you always land on your feet. Trevor is finally on track and doing wonderfully. Be happy for him instead of being so selfish. You already have your basic needs covered by the government. Selfish? I whispered. The word felt like a physical weight. I had served 14 months on a carrier, managing global logistics under the constant threat of drones and missiles, and I was selfish because I wanted to keep the roof I had paid for with my own blood. We put your things in a storage unit on the edge of town, Gary added, as if he were doing me a massive favor. Just get an apartment near the base for now. When Summit Maritime goes public, I'm sure Trevor will give you a nice return on your investment. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. Anger wasn't a loud emotion this time. It was clinical. I realized in that moment that I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for too long, footing the bill for a subscription I never signed up for. I'll call you later, I said, my voice a blade of polished steel. I ended the call before he could respond. Sarah Jenkins didn't offer me a seat or a glass of water when I walked into her office. She simply looked at my uniform, then at the thick manila folder I placed on her mahogany desk. I'd been told she was the most ruthless real estate attorney in San Diego, a woman who specialized in protecting those the law often forgot deployed service members. She didn't have a single family photo in the room, just law books and the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't lead with my feelings, I led with the logistics. I opened the folder and laid out the chronological timeline of my 14-month deployment. I showed her the general warranty deed, transferring my modest beach bungalow for $650,000. Then, I pointed to the signature on the power of attorney document dated October 14th. My signature is a series of sharp, tactical angles, I said, my voice as cold as the deck of a carrier at midnight. The one on this paper is loopy and lazy. It's a forgery. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the notary's stamp. Anyone can claim a signature is forged, Captain Vance. Anyone can claim a signature is forged, Lieutenant Vance. We need something more definitive. I have it, I replied, sliding a second document across the desk. This was an official Department of Defense record signed by my commanding officer. On October 14th, the day this document was supposedly notarized in San Diego, I was on a carrier in the Red Sea. We were under a total military communications blackout due to a regional threat, no emails, no phone calls, and no digital footprints. It was physically impossible for me to be in a California office, signing away my future. For the first time, Sarah Jenkins smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. It was the look of someone who had just found the structural flaw in a high-rise building. Your family didn't just break a trust, Erin. They violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act. That's federal territory. They assumed your deployment was a period of silence. they didn't realize it was also a period of absolute documented protection. I didn't feel a rush of relief. I felt the cold hum of a mission moving into its second phase. This wasn't about a house anymore. It was about a total asset freeze. I watched as Sarah picked up her phone and began dictating an emergency petition to a federal judge. She was targeting Summit Maritime Solutions, Trevor's hollow shell of a company. By using a forged instrument to wire $650,000 across banking institutions, they had triggered a sequence of legal alarms that my brother wasn't equipped to silence. I'm sending a formal notice to the title insurance company and the bank immediately, Sarah said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. By tomorrow morning, Trevor Vance will find every single corporate and personal account associated with Summit Maritime Frozen Solid. He won't be able to buy a cup of coffee with your money, let alone fund his illusions. The silence of the hotel room felt like a vacuum. I sat with my back to the wall, eyes fixed on the glowing screen of my laptop. Trevor thought he was a tech genius because he could buy a sleek website template for his fake company. He didn't realize that in the Navy, we are trained to find the ghosts in the machine. I used a recovery protocol he never even considered. I bypassed his new biometric locks by using an old hardware security key. I left synced to my account before deployment a physical backdoor he didn't know existed. I forced my way back into my primary civilian inbox and reset the master password. I immediately checked the filters and forwarding rules. They were breathtakingly malicious. Every alert regarding my property taxes, every notification from my mortgage lender, and every message from the title company had been automatically intercepted. The rules were set to forward a copy to Trevor, mark the original as read, and move it straight to the trash. He had built a digital wall around my life, leaving me blind while he liquidated my sanctuary. He had even filed a temporary mail forwarding request with the USPS, diverting my bank statements and property tax notices to a P.O. box he controlled. But he had been sloppy. I found a compressed file in a subfolder he had labeled as miscellaneous. Inside was a digital copy of a life insurance policy for $1 million, taken out just 3 months before I deployed. Trevor had used the same loopy forged signature from the house deed to apply for the policy without my knowledge. He wasn't just stealing my assets, he was betting on my death to fund his illusions. I didn't feel a sting of betrayal. I felt a cold, surgical clarity. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I clicked on an archived email thread between Trevor and my mother, Teresa Miller, dated late September. Trevor's words on the screen were a masterclass in depravity. He wrote, and I quote, "She is in a high-risk zone. If she does not make it back, that $1 million payout will take Summit Maritime global. If she comes back, we have already secured the asset by selling the house. We win either way." I stopped breathing for a moment. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. While I was wearing 30 pounds of body armor in 110-degree heat, my brother was calculating the financial upside of me being sent home in a box. He referred to my potential death as a logistical convenience. My mother had not expressed horror. She had replied, less than 20 minutes later, praising his financial foresight. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I printed every single one of those emails. The paper was still warm as I tucked the evidence into my manila folder. I was done being the family doormat. I was a tactical operator now, and I had just identified the primary target. The San Diego Yacht Club was a cathedral of unearned prestige. I drove my battered truck past the line of luxury sedans, pulling right up to the valet stand. I didn't arrive in a cocktail dress. I stepped out of the cab wearing my navy dress whites, every metal pinned with mathematical precision, and my combat deployment patch a silent witness on my shoulder. I walked through the heavy oak doors, the thick manila folder tucked firmly under my arm. The visual contrast was violent. In a room full of people wearing silk and rented tuxedos, my military presence stood out like a warning siren. I didn't seek out my family. I waited until I heard the clink of a silver fork against a crystal glass. Trevor was on stage, standing behind a glass podium that looked as transparent as his lies. He looked every bit the part of a successful CEO, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my annual combat pay. Gary and Teresa were in the front row, beaming with a radiant pride that made my stomach turn. I want to take a special moment to thank my parents, Trevor announced into the microphone, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. They recognized the immense potential of Summit Maritime from the beginning. They made massive family sacrifices, liquidating their own hard earned assets to ensure my dream could become a reality. The ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. My mother wiped a fake tear from her eye. I didn't wait for the applause to die down. I moved with the disciplined, purposeful strides of an officer taking command of a hostile target zone. I didn't ask for permission from the event coordinator. I stepped onto the platform, bypassed my frozen brother, and wrapped my hand firmly around the secondary microphone. A sharp, high pitched squeal of audio feedback sliced through the elegant atmosphere, instantly paralyzing the room. I would like to add to that toast, I said. My voice projected through the sound system with absolute crystal clarity. Trevor's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He reached out to physically grab the microphone away, but I smoothly sidestepped his clumsy advance, with reflexes honed by military combat training. My brother is right about sacrifices, I continued, my gaze sweeping the front row of venture capitalists. But the $650,000 seed capital for this company did not come from my parents' hard work. It came from the unauthorized sale of my home while I was deployed in a combat zone. A collective, audible gasp ripped through the crowd. I opened the folder and held up the forged power of attorney. My parents fabricated my signature on a legal document on October 14th. A day I have military documentation proving I was under a mandatory communications blackout on a carrier in the Red Sea. It was physically impossible for me to sign away my life savings while I was defending yours. Then I delivered the final lethal discovery. I held up the printout of the life insurance policy, and here is the real investment strategy. My brother bought a $1 million policy on my life, calculating the financial convenience of me returning in a box. He bet on my death to fund the champagne. The revulsion in the room was a physical weight. Powerful executives began aggressively typing on their phones, instructing their legal teams to sever all financial ties with Summit Maritime immediately. At that moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with violent force. Sarah Jenkins strode in, flanked by two towering agents in tactical vests emblazoned with the yellow letters of the United States Marshal Service. Trevor Vance, the lead marshal, announced, his voice stripping my brother of his visionary corporate identity. You are being detained for federal wire fraud and felony forgery. My mother collapsed into her dining chair, sobbing for a mercy she had never once shown me. I stood behind the microphone, looking down at the smoldering wreckage of the people who raised me. I felt no vindictive thrill, only the heavy, cold resolution of a mission completed. You wanted me to stop making a fuss? I stated quietly to her weeping form, I am done fussing. This is just the consequences. The legal machinery Sarah Jenkins set in motion moved with a devastating, bureaucratic precision that I didn't need to witness in person. Trevor was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for wire, fraud, and conspiracy. His title as a visionary CEO had lasted less than a month. My parents, Gary and Teresa Miller, received 5 years of probation, but the financial judgment was their true life sentence. To pay the federal fines and legal fees, they were forced to sell the 4-bedroom colonial home they had prized above all else. Every cent of their retirement savings was devoured by the restitution they owed me. They were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a part of San Diego they used to mock for being beneath them. Watching their downfall taught me a vital lesson about the difference between having and being. Trevor and my parents were obsessed with the illusion of power that money could buy. They thought that by occupying a luxury ballroom and wearing tailored suits, they had become superior people. But their status was just a layer of paint applied over a hollow structure. Trevor's position was a temporary rental, funded by my stolen equity. When the money vanished, his importance evaporated instantly because he never possessed the internal character to lead. He had property, but he was never a person of substance. A federal judge eventually signed the order that restored my life. The fraudulent deed was stricken from the public record, and the coastal villa was legally returned to me. I didn't have a key, so I stood on that porch with a locksmith who drilled out the lock cylinders in less than 5 minutes. The pregnant stranger and her husband had already been moved and made whole by the title insurance company. I spent that first weekend aggressively purging the institutionally white paint they had used to cover my earth-toned walls. I sanded the hardwood floors again, the abrasive dust clogging my lungs, but each inch of wood I uncovered felt like reclaiming a part of my soul that they had tried to liquidate. After getting the necessary approval from the HOA to restore the property's original aesthetic, I selected a fresh gallon of paint and finished the job by painting the front door that bright, cheerful victory red once more. I also used a portion of the recovered funds to establish the Vance Defense Fund, a legal nonprofit that provides protection for service members whose families target their assets during deployment. I have come to realize that this journey was never really about the $650,000. It was about the revolution of choosing myself over a family that viewed me as a commodity. To anyone else out there who has ever felt like the invisible child, the workhorse whose only purpose is to absorb the failures of a golden sibling, this is for you. You are not a phase, and your life is not a resource for others to harvest. I have learned that family is not a suicide pact, and loyalty is a debt that must be earned through respect, not just shared DNA. If you find yourself in a situation where your own blood is trying to sell the shelter you built, remember that your resilience is a weapon for your protection, not a tool for their convenience. Forgiveness isn't always about a reconciliation. Sometimes the only way to set yourself free is to let the law take its course and walk away with your head held high. I am a lieutenant, a survivor, and I am finally at peace behind my own red door. Never let blood be an excuse for your exploitation. If you found strength in my story, please share it to protect other soldiers. Don't forget to subscribe to Cherry Vengeance so we can continue to stand for justice together.